I want to introduce Professor David Whyte. And David is a Professor of Socio and Legal Studies at the University of Liverpool. He contributes regularly to open democracy. In fact, there's a great number of things which David has written, which is on open democracy, which you can pick up very easily on the internet. He's also written for The Guardian, The Herald, The Age, and Red Pepper. Written on a great number of topics, in fact. And also, once again, these can be found on open democracy. The corruption in UK general elections written about. Also, the Chilcot Report, Trump's first 100 days, austerity, the details that we die within our means, which I really like that one, Dave. One law for the poor at Grenville Towers. Two neoliberal infernos, Grenville and Piper Alpha. A series of articles about Catalan and Spain. And also recently in 2002, the Tory governments have undermined health and safety for goodness knows how many years. Not only that, but he's also come out with a book, which I showed everyone before, Ecocide. I actually had to look up the meaning of the word ecocide. The nice thing about it, David's just told me now that I need to have bought the book because he's going to tell us all about what's inside. So I'm going to hand straight over to you, Dave. And once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here again. Well, I mean, I'm here all the time, actually, and you're where you are all the time. But the last time I spoke to you was in Chester, in that lovely pub. I can't remember the name of the place, and we had a pint, and that was really nice. And maybe we'll get to do that again someday. So it's great to be able to speak to you, albeit in this form. And look, I do want to say that the point David made there, very nice introduction. Yeah, I mean, I have written about a lot of different things, but I guess my concern is very similar to, I think, the concern of trade union and labour education, which is why do we have inequality repeating in a very similar pattern all the time and in different ways, and also what is the role that capitalism plays in reproducing inequality. And I suppose that's the kind of the basis for why I want to kind of talk about the corporation. And by the corporation, I just mean business organization, profit-making organization, specifically those organizations which are set up as separate entities from their investors. So BP has a separate identity from its shareholders. Shell has a separate, Tesco has a separate identity from its shareholders. And I think I'll get into that a bit later on, because I think that's a really important driver of inequality that we don't kind of recognize. But I'll maybe give some examples from COVID, kind of our experience of going through this pandemic and what's happened in terms of the way, I'll come on to how the Tories have responded, how the government's responded. But I think it's important to think about capitalism, obviously, right? And I suppose before I get to COVID, one of the things that informed the book, look, thanks as well for allowing me to promote my book. I feel like I'm being a bit cheeky here, do you know what I mean? Invited to do a talk, and all I'm doing is promoting the book. I won't hold it up. That's only because David's held it up. But the reason I wanted to start off on the book was, about a year and a half ago, with the emergence of the great youth strike, climate strike movement, and the Schools for Future movement. What was really interesting to me was that the most prominent slogan that you saw people carrying was system change, not climate change, right? And I think young people today are really carrying a torch which is putting capitalism, the system that we live under, at the center of the problems of the planet. And I think that's really, really crucial, because I can't see any way out of the climate crisis if we continue to make and produce and distribute things in the way we do. But I also think that it's very easy for people on the left, and it's one of the big mistakes of the left, to just shout, well, it's capitalism, right? Or it's the bosses, or whatever version of the left it is. I think we need to specify what we mean by that. And unfortunately, the corporation, the private profit-making organisation, which is either owned by shareholders or by private owners, it's where most of the value in our society flows through. It's where most of the money flows through. Corporations control almost all of the things, whether it's chemicals, plastics, oil and gas, that are threatening the future of the planet. So I don't think, I mean, there's a long debate that I won't get into that Marxist academics have about whether the capital has relative autonomy over the state, or is the state always in control. I don't really kind of care about that, because I do think corporations can be reined in and they can be controlled if we did have democratic states, but that's clearly not the case at the moment. So the question for me is, how do we rein them in, and how do we deal with them? And that's really the question that the book asks. And I think, as I sort of indicated a couple of minutes ago, COVID gives us the best examples. I mean, if you look at where, and we don't know exactly where this virus came from or comes from, but we do know where those kind of new SARS, the bird flus, the swine flus, viruses of this ilk originate in animals, and then they mutate and they pass to humans. And there's quite a big body of evidence in science now which shows that a lot of those viruses actually come from areas that are being developed very rapidly and deforested very rapidly. So a number of the viruses that we're having to deal with in the last 10 years have clearly come from areas in which the frontiers have been pushed back, normally by large corporations who are deforesting for meat production or for feed production for meat. These are the big drivers in the Amazon deforestation, for example. And so that process of pushing back the kind of frontiers of wildernesses, I mean, I don't really fully understand the science of it, but I've been reading a lot about the science of it. And the basic issue is that a lot of those pathogens, those what they're called sylvatic pathogens, those wild animal viruses and pathogens, would normally be hosts in species that would then die out with those species, because nobody ever went near them. They were in the wilderness. Now, when you start pushing back the wilderness, you open up a whole series of possibilities for new viruses to emerge. Now, I'm not arguing, that's not an argument against development, but I think it's an argument against the form of development that we use, which is completely uncontrolled, where you have the big fast food companies as the drivers of deforestation. You have the animal feed companies, soy particularly being a driver of deforestation, and they do it at a scale and at a pace that's really uncontrolled and uncontrollable. And that's a very kind of abstract point. But I have to say, I've just mentioned swine flu and pig flu. It's no coincidence that we're talking that these outbreaks, these earlier outbreaks, came from those animals, and it's thought that factory food production is what's increasing the chances of pathogens coming to the surface. And there's a very basic reason. It's basic mathematics, that if you increase the scale of the number of animals you've got in one place, then the ability for a virus to mutate through animals and then get to humans is just increased. I mean, it's just a game of chance, really. So that's the second point. And you've got, an industry now, meat production is pretty much dominated by a small number, as most of our industries are now, by a small number of corporations. Smithfield is the biggest pork manufacturer. I think it controls, I can't remember, but it's certainly up to the 30s, 40% of pork in the US. Tyson and Do are the big controllers of poultry in Europe and in the US. And they've really pushed this revolution in meat production that we kind of know about a little bit from various documentaries. We know that's why we get a chicken. That's why you can buy a chicken in Tesco's for $2.50 now. It's because of these big, and I don't want to undermine the value of that, because, it's important that we have cheap food, but it comes at a cost. I think that's the point. And the cost is obviously borne largely by relatively poor people, or certainly not by those who are profiting from those companies. So the third point I want to make is it's like there's no coincidence either that those sites of food production in the UK are where the big COVID outbreaks are. The big COVID outbreaks are in workplaces where people are kind of crammed together. And it's not, I think we've had four major outbreaks in chicken packing factories. We've had, I mean, actually across the food packing industry, that's where there have been a real hotspots of COVID. I'm not undermining other places where we've seen that in call centres and so on. And that's partly because of the conditions that people are forced to work under. It's probably partly to do with the refrigerated conditions of those food and the virus. This particular virus is maybe specific to that, thriving in cold conditions. But it's also because they're deregulated and people aren't in unions. Now, and if I was speaking to any other audience, I would probably spend a bit of time talking about that. But I think people here realise exactly why that's the case. So the lack of PPE, the lack of ventilation in some of these places is very clearly a function of the fact that people don't have representation on safety. So the conditions of the workplace are also driven largely because most of us at some point, even if we work in a supply chain, we work ultimately for a large corporation. The conditions of the workplace, the kind of Uberization of our workplace has been driven by companies like Uber and Amazon and the big supermarkets and so on. So I think in that's not to say we can pin the blame for COVID on anyone, but certainly the corporate economy has made it very difficult for us to control the virus. And if you look at I mean, that takes me on to the kind of the government's response and what the government's response to this was. And I think it's really important to think about a kind of, the way I describe it is they've retained the autonomy of employers, right? And largely they've retained the autonomy of the big corporations because they are our big employers. So if you remember when the outbreak started, actually still the government gives almost complete autonomy to employers in terms of defining who's an essential and who's not an essential worker. David was talking about open democracy. I mean, I'm not cheerleading for that. There's a lot of dodgy articles, I think, in open democracy. It was a really good one by a woman called Carolyn Malloy, who I think used to be a Unite. People nodding and know who she is. And she documented that between a third and a half of the UK workforce went to their workplace all through the lockdown. She argues it was a fake lockdown, and that's because employers in telecommunications, in banking infrastructure, as well as all of the kind of the delivery drivers and the warehouse workers that we knew about, were still being forced to go to work because the government essentially allowed employers to define who was essential and who wasn't. And the same thing goes for furlough. All of the furlough payments virtually went directly to the HR departments, the payroll departments and HR departments in large companies. They had control over furlough, and we know disastrously for some people whose furlough was ended early because their employer were basically cruelly disposing of them because they were trying to restructure on an early basis. Pimlico plumbers. Do you remember that? I can't remember the name of that crook who basically got rid of the furlough scheme early to make sure that he could only keep the plumbers that he knew were going to work harder for him. So that the furlough scheme has definitely been abused, and then you look at the Rolls Royces and the British Airways and the Ryanairs and the EasyJets who've all laid off workers, but they've at the same time taken huge amounts of furlough money. The autonomy to make decisions like that over our lives was left with private corporations, and many of the companies I've just named got huge loans from the government as well, very favourable terms. This week, actually, well, not this week because this is Monday, but on Saturday, just in the kind of column of, I read it on page 12 of the Financial Times or something. That's how sad I am. It's not what I spend every weekend doing, but I happened to be reading the Financial Times this weekend. I think it was page 12 or something. It had a little article that Rishi Sunak had extended the COVID bailout loans to private equity firms. I mean, it's astounding. Some of you saw that. Like it was announced deliberately, I think, to kind of avoid any kind of focus on this. What that means is the most predatory companies, venture capitalists, who go into companies, buy them up when they're on their last legs, and either keep them going on a life support mechanism to squeeze every last penny out of them, or sell their assets and sack the workers. That's basically the model. I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically the model of private equity. They leverage debt from private investors on the basis that banks won't give companies loans, and they go in and they make a killing. So they're now going to be eligible for the bailout loans. So there's nothing more telling than me in kind of about that nothing more telling about what this government was really trying to do in the COVID economy than that, and that's to retain the status quo, make sure that corporations are still the key drivers of our economy, and prop up this system of profit, which I think is undermining our chances of surviving future epidemics. And that's the kind of feedback loop. I could go further actually, because if you look at finance, I mean, there's some incredible kind of circuits of capital of investment that you can see in this economy. Goldman Sachs, huge investor in a lot of the pharmaceutical, the search for the vaccine at the moment. Goldman Sachs is also a huge investor in big agriculture, huge investor in Smithfield Foods, and some of the companies that I mentioned earlier, right? So some of these huge investment companies, Goldman Sachs, the other kind of private equity companies that I mentioned, will be profiting from wherever they can at the moment. And sometimes these loops have these incredible kind of connections. I saw this thing in April. Goldman Sachs, there was an analyst, it was kind of scandalized very briefly. There was an analyst from Goldman Sachs in the middle of, I think it was just after they'd made a big investment into one of the pharmaceutical companies trying to develop a vaccine. And the analyst was saying, well, is curing patients a sustainable business model? And that was, he was responding to the suggestion that they should be investing in this genetically engineered cell therapy, which might eradicate some medical conditions, which Goldman Sachs was simultaneously investing in for the medicines to deal with those conditions. So you have this kind of, I mean, it struck me that that's a very good example of how, if we're in this loop, we're not really kind of going to get out of it. If the autonomy is left to the Goldman Sachses of this world, or indeed the Amazons and the Ubers and so on. So what does that all mean in terms of what I was writing about in the book? Well, I think it kind of sums up neatly a kind of core point that I want to make, which is that if we leave the control of the economy in the hands of corporations, which we pretty much have done, then we have no ability to kind of get out of that cycle. And there are a number of kind of, I mean, if you look at the way that the companies are pretty much given, I mean, if we just look at what they control, I mean, 70% of emissions apparently are down to about 100 companies. And a lot of these are oil and gas companies. Now, they might move away from oil and gas, and there is some movement of investment into renewable fuels. But last month, the American oil industry spent all its lobbying efforts into a bilateral trade that America was negotiating with Kenya. Now, this sounds quite obscure, but I think it tells us a lot about how that economy works. And what they were trying to negotiate into that deal was that Kenya would buy plastics from American companies, and there was an explicit recognition from those oil and gas companies that when the revenue that they're losing from the decline in the oil price, and also from potentially from having to move away from these technologies, they can only make up through producing plastics. So I think that's a really good example of, if we leave that control in the hands of those corporations, it raises big questions about how we can shift away from an economy which relies on things that are polluting us. And actually, if you go back to almost, I mean, this is not a new story, right? I mean, if you go back to almost all of the things that have been found, some of the kind of most notorious poisons that have poisoned workers and consumers in the last half century or so, you find this incredible pattern, and I'm not going to go back as far as asbestos, but I think the asbestos pattern is pretty much the same. Some people will know that asbestos was first described as the killer dust in Parliament, in a parliamentary report by a factories inspector in 1898, and all of the asbestos companies then knew that it was causing horrific damage, and then I think you know the story now. They spent a very large proportion of their profits over the years trying to distort the evidence and commission their own scientists and so on, right? And the most recent, I can't remember the name of the guy who was outed, but some of you might know Rory O'Neill, who edits Hazards magazine. If you're interested in following this up, the asbestos lobby were involved in discrediting the UK trade union hazards movement up until last year, until that came out in a court case, and that was funded. That kind of discrediting of the evidence in the trade union movement was funded by the asbestos companies now for over 100 years. But if you look at some of the substances, I mean, not far. I'm sitting in Liverpool. You're in Chester, probably equidistant as the crow flies. There's a plant in Ellesmere Port, which is still producing lead to be added to petrol. It gets exported to North Africa. Now, the deadly effects of adding lead compounds to petrol was discovered in the 1920s. We've phased it out because we know it poisons children, but all of the major chemical companies spent years and years and years distorting that information. Bisphenol A, BPA, the plastic that some of you might have heard of that mimics estrogen and causes hormonal damage and has been known to do so since the 1930s. Again, still in production, largely because of that process of distorting scientific knowledge and so on. PCB, polychlorinated biphenyl. Monsanto was the main manufacturer of PCB, which is a kind of lubricant or cooler in electrical equipment. And then their own scientists got evidence of the irrefutable evidence of its health impacts in 1969, and then commissioned its own studies to dispute the evidence. PVC, polyvinyl chloride, there's been a number of workers' class actions around the world. And in 1973, Ethel Corporation, that was major producer at the time, had an internal memo that came out years later which showed a very clear positive carcinogenic effect in terms of those workers' exposures to vinyl chloride. Organophosphates, I mean, sales are still going up of organophosphates. We know of the impact that has on agricultural workers, but there's still a huge lobbying effort by the companies. Glyphosate, you might have heard of Roundup, the Monsanto chemical that they've just been forced to pay out billions in a class action. Well, Monsanto has been spending tens of millions, again, distorting the evidence, commissioning its own studies. So sorry, I'm just giving you example after example, but the book sets out those examples in a bit more detail and shows how the scientists employed by these companies were distorting the evidence. So it's simply, I mean, that tells us that it's simply not enough to think that we can kind of skirt around the margins of a corporate economy and try and put in some incentives for corporations to do a bit better. And that's because actually, and I'm going to be very kind of crude here, they are motivated by, not by one thing. I don't think that's the case. And I certainly don't think that I think there are good managers in companies who want to do the right thing and want to shift their company in a different direction. And I think that's always been the case. But ultimately, in a legal sense, but also in a structural sense, corporations are set up with one primary objective, and that's to make sure that they are successful, to make sure that they make returns for their shareholders and their owners. And no matter how you cut it, that's still the primary legal responsibility. But there's I think there's a much deeper, I mean, I'm going to kind of just I'm not going to go too deep because I've only got 5 minutes really if we're going to have time for discussion. But I think that we also kind of have to think about the way the corporation is structured. So essentially, you have two powerful groups in every corporation, the managers, the directors, And you have the investors, and the investors may be shareholders, or they may be private owners, or they may be those kind of private equity firms that I talked about. And the corporation itself always has a distinct identity in law. It's called corporate personhood. And what that means is, if anything happens, and you know, you'll probably have seen George Monbiot. I'll use this, go back to COVID a minute. You probably see George Monbiot talking about the kind of levels of fraud that have been going on in the COVID economy. You know, a company that was set up and had no history, that was given £4 million to source PPE and so on, right? Well, if you look at every one of those cases, there may be individuals named if the investigative journalist has gone deeply enough, but pretty much they're naming a company. And even if they name individuals, the legal liability for providing the PPE or not providing the PPE will be the company. When there's another excuse my language, but when there's another monumental Serco fuck up that David was kind of indicating, the responsibility will lie with Serco. It won't lie with individual managers, and it certainly won't lie with the investors. The investors are even kind of further removed. So the corporate economy is set up to have a kind of built-in impunity and immunity from legal fallout. Now, sometimes some individuals do go to jail. Martin Winterkorn, the Volkswagen chief executive, is now facing, he could well go to jail. But what's really interesting about that is he's going to go to jail for fraud, for financial fraud, not for potentially polluting the environment with the defeat devices that were issued in Volkswagen's cars. So sometimes managing director CEOs do go to jail. We know that there was a handful after 2008. I think we were talking about that last time I spoke to you. Very few ever do. And if they do, it's generally for financial crimes rather than for killing workers or for harming the environment. And I think that really tells you a lot about how the corporate structure embeds impunity. And I'll kind of say, I think there's an important thing to be said about this historically, and there's a chapter in the book which talks about the relationship between colonialism and the corporation. And some of you might have heard of a company called the South Sea Company, which in the early 18th century was supposed to take over the trade route between Britain and Latin America. It was supposed to be granted by the Spanish the rights to enter Buenos Aires port and start trading, right? And it's an interesting case because it's a case study that is used in every management. Anyone who's studied the kind of history of finance or management will probably know about the South Sea Company, because it's always kind of used as a case study, an example of the first stock market crash. Now, that's really interesting, and it was a kind of Ponzi scheme. It was a fraud scheme. People invested on the promise that they would, and eventually what happened was the war with the Spanish broke out again, and Britain was denied access to those markets. But what's very rarely said in that history is that the South Sea Company was going to be shipping slaves. It was set up to ship 7,000 slaves from Africa to South America, right? So all of these people who lost their money, and they're kind of in those histories, in the case studies that you find in those kind of financial textbooks, they're always seen as victims of a fraud, right? Actually, they were slave traders. And this is a very deceptively simple point. They never had to think of themselves as slave traders. History has never had to think of themselves as slave traders, because all they were doing was buying a share in a company that was doing the slave trading. It was the company that was doing the slave trading. So I think there's something that has endured in our economy that we have to be very careful of. Not only are those corporations in control, but they're also in control in a very dangerous way, in a way that the finance behind them and the people that run them never need to be held fully accountable for what they do. I could go deeper. I could go much deeper, but I think it's good to maybe open up